Hello and welcome to Cheetah Coding. So I'm sure you've heard of Redux and you've heard of the context API. So those two are the most popular ways to manage state, but Recoil is a new state management tool by Facebook that was created last year, around the middle of last year. It's still not very popular yet, but I hope that it replaces Redux. I want to show you an image here of some comparisons between Redux and Recoil. I created this small table here to kind of show why changing to Recoil might be a good idea. Redux has a lot of boilerplate. That's one of the reasons why people are a little bit confused by it. And even if you use hooks with Redux, it still seems a little bit complicated for people that are new to the framework. So Recoil doesn't have a lot of boilerplate. So that's a very good thing. And you'll see the difference soon. Okay. And Redux, you have to create a separate store for your state. And Recoil has no store concept. So your state is split into things called atoms, and we'll talk about that in a bit. So Redux is synchronous by default, and there's no real concurrency tools built into Redux, but there's ways around it if you use extra middleware like Redux Saga. But that just kind of adds to the complexity of Redux. So Recoil has a lot of tools built into it that help you manage asynchronous/concurrent operations. The main concepts of Redux are the store, reducers, actions, and selectors. And in Recoil, there's only two main concepts. Those are atoms and selectors. You update the atoms by using the useRecoilState hook. And there's other hooks too that we'll talk about later. And in Redux, you wrap your app in the provider component. And in Recoil, you wrap your app in the recoil root component. So that's the main differences between Redux and Recoil from a high level perspective. I like it a lot. Let's get started with the actual code. So I'm going to use the code that I created for my Redux videos. If you're not really familiar with Redux and you haven't seen those videos, please check it out. So first, I want to actually change my text here from Redux to Recoil. Okay, and in the package.json, I've already added the Recoil library here. So the first thing I want to do is I want to remove Redux completely from this app. So I'm just going to get rid of this and do it npm install, and then I'm going to actually skip over this part of the video so I don't bore you. Okay, and as you would expect, I'm getting a lot of errors because it cannot find Redux. So the first thing I want to do is I want to go to our index. We've imported our store here and we configured it here, and we wrap our app in the provider for Redux. But now I want to actually get rid of this provider, so we can get rid of this Redux line here. We can get rid of the store lines. And we can instead import something called recoil root. So that will actually wrap our app now. So this gives the app access to the recoil state. Okay. Let's change this name while we're here too. So let's do recoil tutorial. Okay. Save. Reload. We should still get errors. So in our food form here, we want to get rid of the Redux code here too. So let's comment out this line. Let's get rid of the actions. We don't need that either. And we'll comment out these two lines here for our dispatch. Okay, and let's go down here and we will comment this out. And I think that's all of our Redux code in here. So let's save and reload. Okay, and now in our food list, we need to handle that now. So let's go to the food list. This is where we show the list of foods from our Redux tutorial. So let's get rid of these lines here, the action and the dispatch and the selector. Let's comment out all three of these lines now. So we're not going to dispatch our delete current, and we're not going to use our selector here. So let's comment that out too. For now, let's put a empty array in here like so. Okay, and let's get rid of this line here. Save, reload. Okay, and now we get no errors when we load. So we can go to our food list. It's empty. We could type something in here. Our state, our local state here is still the same. So we're still setting our food locally here, but we're no longer submitting it to our list here. Okay. So now I want to just replace our Redux with the recoil state that we had before. Our index is already done, so we can actually just close this for now. And we can close our store. We don't need that anymore. So in our food form here, that's what the screen is. Now I want to use recoil state. I'm going to say constant. Recoil state is very similar to the useState hook. but instead of the state being local, it's hooking into our recoil state itself. Okay, so we say constant, and then you can name it whatever you want to, same as the use state. So we can say food list, and then I want to say set food list. Okay, so our tuple here will include the set food function, which will set our food list. And then we can say equals use recoil state. Okay, so we have our food list and set food list. Now, how do we actually add a food to the list? So let's go to our reducer. You know in Redux that the reducer is in charge for determining what we should do with our state based on a certain action. So for the add food action here, we want to add a food to the list. So let's go back to the food form. Let's go down here, and I'm going to create a new function and call it constant add food. So it'll be named the same as our function in our actions. So let's go to that real quick. So let's go to our action food. And you can see we have add food and delete food. So we pass in the food name here for the add food. Okay, so now we have add food here, and I'm going to pass in the string name that we create here in our input. So pass in name, and then I'm going to call our set food list function here. So I'll show you a better way to do this later on in the video, but for now, I just want to show you the actual procedure that you would use. Okay, so we have add food, and now I want to call our set food list. So before we called add food like this, right? And then that will hook into our reducer, but now we don't have a reducer. So what we create is going to resemble this. So let's go to our food form. I'm going to say set food list. And then that takes in our food list. And then we're going to do something with that. So instead of using concat, I'm going to use a more efficient way actually. And I'm just going to say array. So this new array will include our current array. So we could say spread operator food list. So that says take our items from our existing food list and put it into this new array. And then I'm going to append the new food to that. Okay. So I'm going to create a new object. Our food object has a key and a name. So you can see here a key and name. So for the key, it's going to be math.random again. And for the name, it's going to be the name. So we can just create a shortcut like this here. Okay, so that's the same as saying name. Okay, so now this is a function to add a food using our set food list function from our recoil state. So let's actually use this add food, and we can put it down here. So instead of submit food dispatch function for Redux, we're going to call this function which sets the food list state. Okay, so add food and the name. Okay, so we pass in the food. Okay, so if we save this, this won't quite work yet. So it says that the use recoil state expects an atom or selector. So this recoil state doesn't know where the state is coming from, right? So we need to actually pass something in here that represents the state. So that's where the concept of atoms come in. So I'm going to create a new folder here and just call it atoms. And then I'm going to create a new file, and I'm just going to call it, let's call it food state.js. So creating an atom is very easy. I'm just going to export a constant, and then just call it food list state. And then you say equals atom. So that's the keyword here. And then the atom, you pass in an object which represents the state. So let's go to the docs real quick, and we can look up atoms here. So creating an atom, you pass in a key and a default value. So let's compare that to the Redux way of doing things. So let's go to our reducer. So the initial state is a food list here. So the atom will be similar to this concept here of the initial state in your reducer. So let's go back to the atoms food state. I'm going to create a key, and you can call the key whatever you want to. I'm just going to call it food list state. It just has to be unique to that state or to that atom. Okay. And then for default, it's just going to be an empty array like so. Okay. And that's it. That's our food list state here. So let's go back to the food form. And now we want to pass in the state that we just created. So let's say food list state. Okay, so let's save and reload. So we need to actually import the atom here. So let's go back to our food state. Let's make sure we import that correctly. Okay, so we have our import here. Save. And now we get no error. So let's say pi, submit. And I get an error. Let's go back. Oh, okay, and that's because this should be a lowercase f. Save. Okay, so let's reload. Pi and add food. So let's try to go to our food list now. And you can see nothing is here. That's because we're not using our recoil state in the food list. So let's go and fix that. Let's go back to our food list. And now here, I want to do something similar to what I did in the food form. So let's go back and let's copy this over to our food list. Make sure we import this, use recoil state. And then we want to pass in this food list state. Okay, so let's save. And now you can see we have pi here. So we can go back and we can submit another one, burger, submit. Now you can see we have burger here. So let's add our delete. So before we were using the dispatch function from Redux to call our delete food method and pass in our key. And then we were selecting that state and passing it into here. So back to our food reducer, I'm going to now do something similar that I did with the add food with the delete food. So back in the food list, I'm going to create a new function, call it constant delete food, and we're going to pass in the key. And now I want to use our set food list again. So let's say set food list, and then pass in the food list. And I'm just going to copy this from the reducer. So let's just do food list. Okay. And I think that should be it for the delete food. So we want to filter out the key that we're looking for, which will actually make it removed from the list. Okay. So delete food. Let's go down here now, and we can pass in our delete food and then say data.item.key. Okay, so let's look at this again, make sure that's okay. Looks good. So let's save. And now let's try to delete a food. Let's delete burger. Can't find variable action. So yeah, we no longer have an action now. So let's get rid of this. Save. So let's try to delete the burger. And now it's gone. We can go back and check it again. Still gone. We could add one more. Let's add cheese. And I can see we have cheese here. So the functionality is now the same from both the Redux video that I did and the recoil video that I'm doing now. Now I want to show you how to optimize this stuff a bit. So let's go back to the food form. And if you have noticed here, we're not using the food list. So recoil state has a lot of other hooks built into it that you can use. So say for example, you don't want to use both of these. If you only want to use the setter of your recoil state, then you can actually use a different hook. So I can say constant set food list equals use set recoil state, then pass in the food list state. This is the same thing as this line here. So we're just omitting the actual food list value here. So let's comment this out, save, reload, and let's see if this works the same. Let's pass in pizza, submit, go to food list, and everything works the same way. There's no need to create this tuple if you only want to use the setter or the food list. And if you only want to use the state itself, like the food list, then you can go down here and you can say constant food list equals use recoil value and pass in the food list state. So these are both very handy things. You probably won't want to use both of these for this instance because that won't make any sense. You'll just use this line here. But for any file that you only want to use the setter in, use this. And for any component that you only want to use the actual value, the food list, use use recoil value. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. So let's get rid of this, and let's get rid of this now. And our food list doesn't need to change because we are using both of these here. So now I want to show you how to structure your code in a even more efficient manner so you don't have to actually use recoil state in so many different files. So you can see we're using the state here, and we're also using the recoil state in the food form. So a better way to do this would actually be to create a custom hook. So I'm going to assume that you understand the concept of hooks already. So I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to call it hooks, and I will create a new file, and I'm going to call it useFoodList.js. So there's two reasons why I want to use a hook for the recoil state. The first reason is that I want to centralize a place where I use this recoil state. So I only want to call it in one place. And I also want to add my functions to that state. So I'm abstracting out the actual food state and the functions that modify that state into one file. Very similar to what the reducer is doing here. So you can see the reducer, we have our state here, and we have different ways to modify our state based on different actions. So the hook is going to be very similar to the reducer and the purpose that it serves. So I hope that makes sense. Let's go to the use food list hook, and let's create this now. I'm going to say export constant. I'm going to call it use food list. Creating a custom hook involves creating a functional component, and we can add our own hooks inside of here. So we have a use food list function here, and now I want to add our use recoil state here. So I want to say constant food list. So similar to what we had before in the other files, equals use recoil state, and then pass in the food list state. Okay, so now I want to add our functions from before. So let's add our add food. So I'm going to remove this function and add it to our use food list hook. So paste. And instead of returning this here, I'm going to not have this be a arrow function. So I'm just going to do this, get rid of this, and we'll have that be a function keyword. Okay, because I don't actually want to return anything from this function. Let's go copy our other, first let's save this. So let's go copy our delete food here. So we can get rid of this, save. Let's go to our hook. Then I want to paste this in here. Just do function. Okay, and now from this entire hook, I want to return these functions. So I want to return our food list, and I want to return our functions to modify that state. So we are creating a hook around our recoil state. So instead of passing in the recoil state in different places, we further abstract that to create functions that modify our state, and then we allow other components to access only those functions. So let's return, I'm just going to return an object that has these inside. So I'm going to return first the food list, then add food, and delete food. And you can see how you can expand this hook to allow more functionality like updating foods and etc. Okay, but for now we're just gonna have add food and delete food. So let's save. Let's go back to the food form and let's reload. If you would try to add something, you would expect that we would get an error, right? Cannot find add food. So now we're going to actually import our hook and use it here, just like the use state hook and the use recoil state hook. But now we are not going to use the use set recoil state hook. So let's just get rid of this entirely. And we can get rid of the state. Oh yeah, and I imported this by mistake before. Let's get rid of this. And I'm going to call it, I don't want to call it use food list. Let's just call it food hook equals use food list. Okay, and that's it. So that kind of replaced that whole recoil state line. So we have food hook, and now down here, instead of add food, we could say food hook dot add food, and then just pass in the food. Okay. Let's change this word here. Okay, and back to the food list. Now I don't want to use recoil state or food list state. Let's get rid of these. And let's get rid of these two lines up here. And down here, I'm going to say constant food hook equals use food list. So we have our food hook now. And I would say food hook dot delete food and food hook dot food list. Okay, let's save. Let's reload and test. So let's test the empty array. Looks good. Let's add some foods. Let's add pie, curry, and rice. Go to food list. You can see we have our pie, curry, and rice here. Let's try deleting a food. Delete curry. Curry is gone. And it's still gone. Okay, so now our code works exactly like before, and we have a lot less code. Back to the docs real quick. Now I want to talk about selectors. Selectors let you create derived state. Okay, so we have our atoms here and we have our selectors here. So for a selector, you pass in a key just like a normal atom, but instead of the default, you have the getter here. So this getter returns whatever state you want that's based on a different state. Okay, so I will show you how to do that real quick. I'm going to go down here and I'm going to say export constant. Okay, so for this, I want to know the list size. Okay, so I want to call it list size equals selector. I don't know why I didn't put it in the same line here. So put that in here. Pass in an object with the key. Let's call it list size. And I'm going to create a getter. We return the value that we want based on the state. So we say get food list state. And this is a array. So I want to say dot length. Okay, and I'm probably missing a parentheses. Yeah, I'm missing this one. Okay, and I think that should be good. So this getter is how you access different pieces of state, okay? So you would say get and use whatever state that you want to use here, okay? You can do a lot more complicated operations in here if you need to, like they do in the docs here. They do a lot of filtering on the list and so forth, okay? So let's actually use this now. Let's go to the food form. Let's go back to the state real quick. It's giving me a warning. Not sure why. Let's reload. Okay, it's gone now. Let's go to food form and let's go up here and import our selector. So I'm going to say constant food list size equals use recoil value. So the actual procedure to import a selector would be the same as the atom. So you can use recoil state value or use set recoil state. But we only care about the value itself. Okay, so we could pass in the list size. And I'm using the state directly inside of this component. You could add it to the hook in different ways if you want to. You can create a separate hook for it. But for now, I just want to show you how to actually use it. So let's save. Let's go down here to our food list string. Go to food list. And I want to actually show the number of items next to this string here. So after go to food list, I want to add that food list size here. So save. You can see it's 0 by default, which is what we expect. Okay, so let's reload. And now I want to add some items to the list. So let's go up here and I want to say pasta, press submit. You can see we have one here now. Let's go up here, say orange, 2, burger, 3. So you can see that this state is being updated based on this state. So that's a pretty cool concept, and it's very easy to use in Recoil. Redux has selectors too, but I feel like things are a lot easier to understand with Recoil. So whenever we update the state, this list size will also be updated, which means that we will be notified of that here, and our component will rebuild with the new value. Okay, I think that's all I wanted to talk about with Recoil now. I've been playing around with it a lot, and I definitely plan on using it going forward. It's still in beta, but it seems pretty stable. Like, I've had no issues with it so far. So let's go ahead and clean up our code here too. Let's delete all this stuff. Let's delete. Can delete all this. Okay, so going over this one more time. We created our atoms which hold our state. We pass in a default value to our state. And we can also have selectors which create a different piece of state based on the value of another state. And then I created a custom hook that holds all of our recoil state inside of it. And it also has a few functions that help us modify the state without calling the setter directly. And then in our food form, we are using the food list hook to add a new food. We can delete this too. To add a new food. And in our food list, we are using our food hook to display the food list and to delete a food based on the key. So I hope you can see how much code was reduced. Like, our index is so much cleaner now too. We don't have all this provider and store stuff here. All that stuff is gone now. Yeah, I like Recoil a lot. I highly recommend trying it out. It's only in beta, but it's pretty stable so far, if you ask me. And it's created by Facebook too. So you know that it's going to work with React, and it's going to be updated a lot too. So definitely give it a try. And I think I want to cover more state libraries in the future too. There's a lot more out there than just Context API and Redux. Yeah, stay tuned for the next video, and happy coding. Bye.